I spent 31 years believing I was the family disappointment. Not because anyone ever said it outright at first, but because of the way my mother's eyes would slide past me at every holiday photo, landing instead on my sister's face like she'd finally found something worth looking at. My name is Rachel, and for my entire childhood, my family had a nickname for me: the ugly one. My sister was the pretty one, my brother was the smart one, and me? I was just the one who didn't fit anywhere. But at our family reunion this spring, a woman I had never met in my life stood up in front of everyone, pulled a business card from her purse, and said words that shattered everything my family had built their identity around. Have you ever had a stranger see you more clearly than your own blood ever did? I grew up in a house in Ohio where labels were handed out at the dinner table like chores. My younger sister, Willow, got called beautiful before she could even walk. My older brother, Dean, was praised for every spelling test, every science fair ribbon. And I was Rachel, the middle child, the one my grandmother once described in front of an entire Thanksgiving table as the plain one. Bless her heart, I remember being 9 years old, staring into a bathroom mirror, trying to figure out what was wrong with my face. Nothing was wrong. I know that now. But when you're a child and the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally keep comparing you to a standard you'll never meet, you start believing the comparison is the truth. My mother never corrected anyone. She just laughed along, like it was harmless family humor. Was it ever harmless to you, growing up? Because it never felt harmless to me. By the time I was in high school, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Willow got a car for her 16th birthday. I got a secondhand bicycle and a comment about how I should be grateful I had legs that worked. Dean got sent to a private tutoring program to prepare for college applications. I got told that academics weren't really my thing and that I should focus on something more realistic. I worked 2 part-time jobs to pay my own way through community college while my siblings had everything handed to them. I told myself it was building character. I told myself I didn't need their approval. But every single family dinner, every holiday, every birthday, I sat at that table absorbing quiet cruelty disguised as jokes. And some part of me kept hoping that one day it would stop. My mother's sister, Aunt Carol, was the family's self-appointed spokesperson for cruelty wrapped in concern. She had a way of saying the most devastating things with a smile, like she was doing you a favor by being honest. Rachel, have you thought about getting your eyebrows done? Something to soften your face? She said things like that since I was 13. Aunt Carol adored Willow. She would introduce her to every guest at every gathering as my gorgeous niece, the one who's going places. Me, she introduced differently when she bothered to introduce me at all. Sometimes she'd just gesture toward me and say, "And that's Rachel," like I was an afterthought attached to the family rather than a full person in my own right. Can you imagine growing up as someone's afterthought? At 22, I moved 3 states away. I told my family it was for a job opportunity, which was true, but it was also an escape. I needed distance from a house where my worth was measured against my sister's cheekbones and my brother's report cards. I built a career in supply chain logistics, something none of them understood or cared to ask about. I got promoted twice in 4 years. I bought my own condo. I built friendships with people who never once commented on my appearance, who valued me for my mind, my humor, my loyalty. For the first time, I felt like a whole person instead of a comparison point. But even from 3 states away, my family's voice lived in my head. Old wounds don't need proximity to stay open. This past spring, my mother called to invite me to the annual Whitfield family reunion, an event my extended family had hosted every June for as long as I could remember. Every cousin, aunt, uncle, and grandparent under one roof at my grandparents' old farmhouse in Pennsylvania. I almost said no. I had spent years slowly detaching from the emotional chaos of these gatherings. But something in me wanted to go. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the small, stubborn hope that things had changed. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could walk into that house as a grown woman and not shrink. Have you ever gone back somewhere painful, just to prove you could survive it? I called my best friend, Priya, that night and told her I was thinking about going. She reminded me of every story I'd ever told her about that house, every dinner table jab, every birthday overshadowed by someone else's achievement. You don't owe them another chance, she said. But I wasn't going for them. I was going for the version of myself who used to sit at that table wishing she could disappear. I wanted her to know she was safe now. I arrived at the farmhouse to the familiar sound of laughter that seemed to quiet slightly whenever I entered a room. Willow, now 34, was holding court near the porch, surrounded by cousins admiring her new engagement ring. Dean was talking business with my uncles, everyone nodding along like he'd invented the concept of success. My mother hugged me briefly, the kind of hug that lasts exactly as long as social obligation requires. Aunt Carol looked me up and down and said, "Rachel, you look rested, not good, not pretty, rested, like I was a mattress." I smiled and walked past her, reminding myself I didn't come here for their approval. That's when I noticed her. A woman I didn't recognize, maybe in her 50s, wearing a sharp navy blazer that looked distinctly out of place among the reunion's casual sundresses and cargo shorts. She was standing near the garden, watching the crowd with the calm focus of someone observing rather than belonging. I assumed she was someone's plus one, maybe a co-worker of my uncle's. I had no idea that within the hour, this stranger would change the way my entire family looked at me forever. Aunt Carol spotted her too, and with her usual theatrical flair, decided to make introductions. She grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the woman like I was a prop in her performance. Aunt Carol introduced Willow first, gushing about her engagement. Then Dean, praising his new promotion. Then she turned to me, paused for effect, and said to the stranger with a smirk, "And this is Rachel. She's the one we don't really talk about." I felt my stomach drop. 31 years old, and I was still being humiliated in front of strangers like it was a family tradition. I wanted to disappear into the grass beneath my feet. But the woman in the navy blazer didn't laugh along the way everyone else always did. Instead, her expression shifted into something sharp, something almost offended on my behalf. What would you have done in that moment, standing there exposed in front of a total stranger? The woman reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a business card. She held it out, not to Aunt Carol, but directly to me. "Actually," she said, loud enough for the nearby cousins to hear, "I'm here because of her. Rachel is the reason I flew in from Chicago this weekend." The card read, "Margaret Ellis, Senior Talent Director, Ellis and Vance Logistics Consulting Group." My family stared, confused. I stared too, because I recognized the name. Margaret had been quietly following my career for over a year, ever since I'd led a supply chain restructuring project that had saved my company nearly $2 million. A project that had gotten attention in industry publications. She explained, calmly and clearly, that she'd been trying to recruit me for months, and that she'd come to the reunion because I'd mentioned it briefly in a professional networking event. Never expecting she'd actually show up, I wish I could describe the silence that followed. Aunt Carol's smirk evaporated. My mother's mouth opened slightly, like she was trying to reconcile the daughter she'd dismissed for 3 decades with the woman a stranger had flown across the country to meet. Willow looked genuinely stunned. Dean, for the first time in years, looked at me like I was someone worth paying attention to. Margaret continued, unprompted, telling the group about the innovative systems I'd designed, the teams I'd led, the respect I'd earned in my industry. She wasn't doing it to help me get revenge. She had no idea about the nicknames, the years of humiliation. She was simply telling the truth about who I had become. But sometimes the truth, spoken plainly by an outsider, does more damage to years of cruelty than any planned confrontation ever could. I could have stayed quiet and let the moment do its work, but something in me needed to finally say what I'd swallowed for 31 years. I turned to my family and said, calmly, "You spent my whole life calling me the ugly one, the one nobody talked about. I built an entire career, an entire life, while carrying that weight every single day. And the funny thing is, I never needed your approval to do it. My voice didn't shake. I wasn't yelling. I was simply telling the truth, standing tall in front of the people who'd spent decades trying to shrink me. Have you ever felt the exact moment your own voice stopped trembling in front of people who used to intimidate you? Aunt Carol tried to laugh it off, saying it was all just family teasing, that I was being too sensitive. But Margaret, still standing beside me, wasn't having it. She looked directly at my aunt and said something I'll never forget. There's a difference between teasing and tearing someone down for 30 years. I think you know which one this was. The other relatives who had once laughed along with Aunt Carol's jokes suddenly found their shoes very interesting to look at. Nobody defended her. For the first time in my life, the silence in that room wasn't directed at me. It was directed at the people who had spent years making me feel small. Later that evening, my mother found me alone by the garden, the same spot where I'd first noticed Margaret. She apologized quietly, admitting she'd let the family dynamic go unchecked for too long because it was easier than confronting her sister. It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't erase 31 years. But it was the first honest conversation we'd had in longer than I could remember. And I chose to accept it as a beginning rather than dismiss it as too little too late. She told me she remembered moments over the years when she almost said something, almost stopped Aunt Carol mid-sentence, almost pulled me aside to tell me none of it was true. But she never did, and admitting that out loud seemed to cost her something. I didn't rush to comfort her. I let the discomfort sit between us for a moment, because I think we both needed to feel the weight of what silence had cost our relationship. Have you ever had to let an apology just breathe, without immediately forgiving everything? I left the reunion that night different than I'd arrived. Not because a stranger had validated my career, but because I finally understood something I should have known all along. My worth was never something my family had the power to define. They had spent years building an identity around comparing me to my siblings, and I had spent years quietly believing them. Margaret and I stayed in touch. I eventually accepted a leadership position at her firm, a role that challenged me in ways I'd never imagined for myself. But the real victory wasn't the job. It was walking into a room full of people who used to make me feel invisible, and realizing I no longer needed them to see me at all. Because I had finally learned to see myself. If there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this: the labels other people give you, even the ones from your own family, are not the truth of who you are. Sometimes it takes a stranger, an outsider with no history and no bias, to reflect back the version of you that's been there all along. Don't wait 31 years like I did. You are allowed to define your own worth, starting today. If my story meant something to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below.